You wake up in a cold room. Not the kind of cold where you say, "Ugh, I need socks." No, the kind of cold where your bones seem to rattle like a windshield made from regret. You don't know where you are at first. Then you notice the unmistakable smell of mildew, sheep grease, and what can only be described as ye old disappointment. Congratulations. You're in the Middle Ages. And no, there is no thermostat. Your bed is made of straw, stuffed into a sack that's been stitched together with more hope than competence. You sit up. The pillow, if you can call it that, feels like a bag of turnips someone stepped on repeatedly while debating theology. There's a window, sort of, but it's just a hole in the wall. Glass hasn't been invented for your tax bracket yet. You hear the sound of hooves in the distance and the low, dramatic moan of a cow that seems to be contemplating mortality. Or indigestion. Hard to say. You rub your eyes and stretch, and that's when it hits you. Echoes. You hear an echo. Your own yawn, bouncing faintly off the wooden beams like a ghost too polite to haunt you directly. It's unsettling. You wonder what it is. And if you lived in 2025, you'd say, "Oh, that's just sound waves bouncing off surfaces." But you don't live in 2025. You live in medieval Europe, and in medieval Europe, nobody really knows anything about anything. So naturally, you think the echo is either the devil or a forest spirit trying to flirt with you. Probably the devil, though. The devil gets blamed for everything in this era. Bad harvest? Devil. Sneeze twice in a row? Devil. Echo in the barn? Yep, devil. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what we do here. And I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I always find it fascinating to see who's joining us on these weird, sleepy little history dives. Now, let's continue. Now, let's talk about your options. You're probably a peasant. Most people are. Nobility is reserved for people with more sheep than teeth and the right last name. So you're stuck trying to figure out why your voice bounces back at you when you yell "hey" into a valley. And since you don't have Google, Wikipedia, or even an uncle who finished school, you turn to the next best thing. Folklore. And panic. You ask the village elder, a woman who is either 35 or 87. It's hard to tell. She's missing half her teeth and smells like pickled garlic and regret. She tells you, in all seriousness, that echoes are the voices of spirits who live in the hills. They repeat what you say because they're mocking you. Naturally. Because that's what spirits do. They have eternity, and this is how they spend it, making fun of peasants. Someone else says echoes are the voices of fairies, tiny, winged creatures with nothing better to do than hide in caves and imitate your voice. If you hear an echo in the woods, you're supposed to say, "Thank you, kind spirit," and leave a crust of bread nearby. Not for the echo, for the fairy. Because if you don't, they might switch your baby with a log. That's a real fear. A log baby. Welcome to medieval parenting. Some folks think echoes are trap souls. People who died violently or forgot to be buried with a priest present. They're stuck in limbo, doomed to repeat everything you say, forever. Which makes you wonder how many poor souls are stuck saying, "Is anyone there?" for eternity. A rough afterlife, really. No wine, no redemption. Just echo duty. Now you're getting concerned. Because last week, you shouted "shut up" into a canyon and it shouted "shut up" right back. Was that a ghost? Are you haunted now? Should you do a ritual? Do you even have a ritual? Is the priest going to charge you for a blessing again? Yes. The answer is always yes. You walk to the chapel to ask about the echo. The priest is busy explaining how thunder is God's anger and leprosy is divine punishment for pride. You politely wait your turn, which takes 37 minutes because Margaret is confessing again. When you finally ask about echoes, the priest squints at you and says echoes are demons whispering back what you said so they can tempt you later. You nod solemnly. You don't believe him. But what choice do you have? A traveling monk once passed through your village. He had 3 teeth, 8 theories, and 1 sock. He said echoes are caused by the air being disturbed by your words and then hitting hills and bouncing back like a drunk pilgrim trying to find his tent. You found that oddly comforting. The idea that sound could travel, move, return, like a homing pigeon, or the plague. Let's pause here for a moment and talk about how sound worked in medieval thought. Or more accurately, how it didn't. Most people didn't think of sound as vibration. They thought of it as a force, like a puff of invisible wind shaped like your voice. When you spoke, your words traveled out of your mouth in tiny little sound ghosts, flapping around in the air until they hit a wall. Then they bounced. That was the best-case scenario. Worst case, the sound didn't bounce. It just hung there, which meant someone might hear it later. This was deeply concerning. Not because of privacy, there was none, but because it meant that words could linger. And words were powerful. After all, this was a time when saying the wrong thing could get you fined, flogged, or excommunicated. Speech was risky business. So naturally, echoing speech? That felt like trouble. Maybe even magic. Words that refused to die. Children were told not to shout into wells. Why? Because wells are deep and dark and mysterious and sometimes scream back. Some believed that wells could remember what you said. That they were listening. That echoes weren't really echoes, but replies from the underworld. It's hard to overstate how paranoid people were about underground things. It wasn't just about hell. It was also about goblins, trolls, and old kings buried with curses. Let's zoom out. Echoes were seen differently depending on where you were in Europe. In England, they were mostly spirits. In Germany, they were often warnings. In Italy, where people were always a little more poetic about their doom, echoes were the size of the earth. Romantic, in a way. The earth hears you and sighs back. In medieval France, they said echoes came from La Dame de la Pierre, the Lady of the Stone. A ghost woman who lived inside cliffs. She'd repeat your words if she liked them. If she didn't, she'd stay silent. Yes, even back then, women were ghosting men. You travel a bit. Not far. No one travels far unless they're a merchant, a criminal, or on a pilgrimage to somewhere they'll probably die. But maybe you go to the next village. And there, you hear about a farmer who tried to banish an echo. He threw salt at it, then holy water, then a chicken. No, it didn't help. But the chicken was fine. The echo stayed. The villagers held a mass to chase it out. It worked for 3 days. Then someone sneezed near the barn, and the echo came back. People called it cursed land. They sold it to a shepherd who was slightly hard of hearing. He never noticed the echo. Back in your own village, people start using echoes as omens. If you hear your name echoed back, it means someone's thinking about you. If it echoes twice, it's a lover. If 3 times, a ghost. If not at all, you're probably alone and unloved and should consider monastic life. If your goat's bleeding echoes, bad luck. If it doesn't, also bad luck. Medieval omens weren't exactly uplifting. Even the scholars of the time didn't fully understand echoes. The rare few did any kind of thinking about sound wrote things like, sound is like a thrown rock that vanishes when it hits the wall, but then another rock flies back mysteriously. And that's the scientific explanation. You're welcome. Theologians, of course, had other ideas. Echoes were metaphors for sin. You shout into the world, and the world shouts back. Your actions have consequences. Your words, like stones in a pond, ripple outward and return to you in time. That kind of thing. Very dramatic. Very guilt-inducing. Excellent for sermons. And then there's the myth of Echo herself, the Greek nymph who could only repeat what others said. You don't know that myth because you've never heard of Greece or myths or books. But in some distant monastery, some educated monk is reading Ovid by candlelight, smiling to himself. Ah, he says, the echo, a punishment for deceit, a voice without power. Then he goes back to copying it by hand for 14 hours, because printing isn't a thing yet. Not for another few hundred years. But for you, the echo remains a mystery. A sound that returns. A voice with no source. A reminder that the world is bigger than it seems. And slightly mocking. So you lay down again, on your bag of turnips mattress, listening to the sounds of the night. A goat bleating. A distant owl. Your neighbor coughing violently. You yawn. You say goodnight out loud. And somewhere, faintly, the echo says goodnight back. Whether it's a ghost, a fairy, a demon, or just the wind playing tricks, you don't really care anymore. Because frankly, you're too tired to deal with it. And because medieval life is exhausting. And because your mattress still smells like betrayal. You wake up again. This time, it's raining. You know this because you can hear it through the roof. Or rather, in the roof. You roll over, and the straw mattress emits a noise that sounds vaguely like betrayal soaked in sheepspit. That's because it is betrayal soaked in sheepspit. The ceiling above you has sprung a leak, and now it's dripping directly onto your forehead with the rhythm of a passive-aggressive clock. You sigh. And because you sigh too loudly, the barn across the way sighs back. Or at least that's what it sounds like. That distant, breathy repetition of your sadness. That's the echo again, still haunting you like an unpaid tithe. You think back to what your cousin said last week. The one who claims he saw a firefly turn into a saint. He said echoes come from hollow hills, sacred places where old gods sleep. If you disturb them, they echo back as a warning. Go away, they say. This is our nap time. Which, honestly, you respect. Everyone deserves a nap. He also said if you hear your echo at night, it's because a forest spirit is listening. If the spirit repeats your words gently, it likes you. If it yells them back angrily, it's angry. If it doesn't reply at all, you're dead within a fortnight. So, no pressure. In Ireland, they tell a different story. Echoes, the old men claim, are the voices of the city, the fae folk, but not the cute, Disney kind. These are the fae who kidnap humans and leave behind something that looks like you but cries like a banshee and has a disturbing fondness for eating rocks. If you hear an echo in the hills of Ulster, you'd best leave an offering, butter, bread, or your loudest cousin. Otherwise, they might take your voice. Or your cow. Sometimes both. You once met a traveler from the Alps. His beard was made of icicles and trauma. He said echoes live in the mountains, each peak a house for a different sound spirit. He told you about a village where people whispered outside because the mountains would repeat everything they said hours later. At first, it was funny. Then, eerie. Then downright annoying. Especially when the mountains started finishing people's sentences like a smug best friend who already knows the punchline. Eventually, the village decided it was cursed. Naturally, they moved 3 miles east and blamed the rocks. Meanwhile, in the Byzantine Empire, if you were lucky enough to know someone literate, people were reading about sound reflections in ancient Greek texts. Some thought sound worked like light. It bounced. Like a very tired, invisible rubber ball. Philosophers debated whether sound was made of air particles or elemental humors or possibly divine farts. Not the technical term, but spiritually accurate. Theologians in Constantinople wrote treatises on how echoes might be angelic messages, disguised as repetition. They even had a theory that echoes were God's way of telling you to listen to yourself more. Which, frankly, is the kind of spiritual passive aggression that feels very on brand for the medieval church. But here's where it gets wild. You're in a village that celebrates the feast of St. Julian. Nobody really remembers what Julian did, but they're 90% sure he once punched a demon for whispering in an echo. And so now, every year, the village gathers in the main square. They wear wool hats with feathers. They bake terrible oatcakes. And they yell compliments into the hills. You're beautiful. Your beard is majestic. Nice ankles. Just to see if the echo will reply sweetly. If it does, it means Julian is watching over them. If it doesn't, they dunk the baker in a pond. You know, just in case. Now, let's talk about how people tried to control echoes. Not in a scientific way. That would be too modern. This is the Middle Ages. Here, we use rituals, herbs, and misguided optimism. Some monks believed that certain stones absorb sound. If you held one close and whispered your secrets, the stone would keep the words until you smashed it. Then, the sound would be released into the air like a very confused ghost. This was used for confession. Not actual confession, mind you. Secret, backup confession. Just in case the priest was having a bad day and took notes. One manuscript from 1324 describes a ritual for quieting an echo. It involves 1 dead mole, a candle made of goat fat, a circle of salt, and a vow of silence lasting 7 sunrises. No one knows if it works, mostly because anyone willing to perform this ritual hasn't spoken since, or because they died of mole-related infections. In Scandinavia, echoes were blamed on huldufolk or hidden people. Not quite elves. Not quite trolls. More like that weird neighbor who always knows your business. If you heard an echo near a mountain, you were supposed to sing a lullaby to it. If the echo sang back, the hidden people approved. If not, you were to leave fish and alcohol as an apology, which is arguably also just good manners. In Islamic Golden Age texts, philosophers like Al-Kindi wrote about echoes being the result of air disturbance due to vocal energy. Pretty advanced. But of course, that never made it to your village. Your village is still using duck entrails to forecast the weather. You asked once how the entrails work. They said, "Look, it's complicated. Now pass the knife." In France, there was a village that thought echoes were caused by witches hiding in the cliffs. So they burned the cliffs. Not even kidding. They set fire to a rock wall. It did not stop the echo. It did cause a small landslide. No one was injured, but a goat named Philippe was emotionally scarred forever. And yet, despite all of this, people lived with echoes. They feared them, blamed them, turned them into folklore. But they also accepted them. Because in a world where everything is uncertain, your crops, your health, your social status, your continued survival, it's actually kind of nice to have something that always responds. Even if it's just a hollow version of yourself. You begin to wonder, what if echoes weren't fearsome at all? What if they were just lonely? What if, buried deep in those hills and wells and valleys, something just wants company? Something that only knows how to repeat. Like a child imitating an adult. Or a god trying to understand you. But then again, maybe it's just a cave. Maybe your voice is just bouncing. Or maybe there's a spirit of repetition who's been cursed to answer every call for eternity, and he's deeply annoyed at your pronunciation. You lay back again, listening. There it is, your neighbor shouting at his chickens. "Get back here, Henrietta. Henrietta." And the hills repeat, "Henrietta." It's oddly soothing. Like nature is joining the argument. You close your eyes and think about the absurdity of it all. Echoes, goats, molekanda rituals. The fact that someone once tried to exorcise a hill. And then it hits you. This world doesn't need to make sense. It never did. But it always responds. Even if it's just a whisper, a sigh, or a distant voice in the fog. Echoes remind you, you were here. You spoke. And something, somewhere, answered. Even if it doesn't have a mouth. Even if it's just a hollow hill filled with sheep farts. That's still something. Now drift off, if you can. Let the echo say goodnight once more. Or tell you to shut up. It's a mystery. And that's the magic of the Middle Ages. Nothing makes sense. But everything echoes. You wake up in a monastery. Not because you're holy. You're not. You once stole a turnip out of spite and got caught. But you were offered mercy by the Lord Bishop. Which is medieval for congratulations, you're now an unpaid monk in training. The room is silent except for the gentle creaking of wood and the snores of Brother Elric, who sounds like a dying accordion being strangled by a ghost. You're lying on a wooden board, not a bed. It has a blanket that feels like someone spun it out of bark and penance. You breathe in the scent of incense, mold, and old cheese. You think that last one might be you. The bell tolls. You groan, roll over, and mutter a complaint into the stone wall. "I hate this place." And the wall, as if possessed by the spirit of passive-aggressive saints, mutters it back. "I hate this place." And there it is again, the echo. But here, in the monastery, that echo isn't just a sound. It's a sign. According to the abbey's librarian, Brother Mauric, who owns exactly 41 teeth and 0 friends, the echo is a spiritual mirror. God speaks twice, he says, once through your mouth and again through the world. Which, sure. But also, maybe you just built the monastery in an acoustically cursed ravine. The clergy love metaphors. If your voice echoes, that's God reminding you to listen. If the echo is faint, you're spiritually distant. If it doesn't come back at all, you've fallen out of grace. Or you're shouting into a field of hay. Either way, someone's judging you. Echoes are used in sermons constantly. Like an echo in the hills, so too does sin return unto thee, says the local priest. It sounds poetic, until you realize he's yelling this in a stone church, and now you can hear it 3 times. Sin, sin, sin. It bounces off the altar like a divine tennis match. So before we go further, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if your spirit genuinely resonates with this sleepy absurdity. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it in your corner of the medieval cosmos? I love knowing which part of the planet is listening to echoes at 3 a.m. Back in the monastery, monks debate echoes more than you'd expect for men with so much silence in their daily schedule. Some say echoes are the trapped voices of angels, repeating God's last command. Others insist it's the devil mimicking the voice of Mun to tempt him into vanity. One particularly sweaty monk, Brother Aloysius, insists that if your echo changes your words slightly, it means Satan is nearby, twisting your intent. Which is hilarious because he also once claimed that sneezing twice in a row opens a portal to hell. Nobody takes him seriously anymore, but he does make excellent lentil stew. Of course, these interpretations vary. In Germany, echoes in monasteries were thought to be the voices of martyrs still echoing their final prayers. In Spain, it was a test of faith, shouting a psalm into a canyon and waiting for the words to come back. If they echoed clearly, it meant divine favor. If they didn't, time to flagellate. In some areas of Italy, particularly in hilltop churches, echo chambers were deliberately built into the architecture. Not for acoustics, not for music, but so priests could demonstrate the power of divine repetition. You go into a side chapel, whisper a confession, and hear it softly repeat back to you, as if God himself were saying, "I heard that." Gross. Sometimes this went wrong. There's a story, probably exaggerated, but too good not to repeat, about a young novice who practiced his sermon alone in the chapel. He shouted "Repent" into the apse. The echo came back, but with extra words. "Repent, you fraud." He ran screaming, shaved his head twice, and lived the rest of his life in a well. They called him Saint Sebastian, the echoary. He's not canonized yet. Church authorities occasionally used echoes as divine lie detectors. A suspicious monk might be asked to speak a sacred phrase into a cavern. If the echo returned clean, he was innocent. If it garbled, guilty. This is known as trial by repetition. It was just as inaccurate and terrifying as trial by fire, only with more shouting. And then, of course, there were the holy texts. Some obscure Latin commentaries contain pages analyzing the book of Job through acoustic metaphors. Echoes as divine suffering. Echoes as unanswered prayers. Echoes as the reverberations of divine silence, which is ironic because these texts were usually read aloud by someone who mumbled. There's one manuscript, preserved in the Abbey of St. Wulfstan the Paranoid, that classifies echoes into 3 types. Divine echo comes back softer, like a whisper from heaven. Sinful echo comes back louder, like your guilt yelling at you. Demonic echo doesn't match what you said and may curse at you in Old Frankish. Scholars today believe this was mostly a result of poor acoustics and even worse theology, but in the Middle Ages, people took it seriously. They built entire doctrines around the sound of their own voices. And honestly, who doesn't? Now let's talk about relics. Because yes, there were relics related to echoes. In one corner of France, there's a church that claimed to house the stone of the last echo. It was allegedly the rock where Saint Cecilia once sang a hymn so beautiful that the air repeated it for 7 days. Pilgrims would come, sing into the rock, and wait. Some heard a reply. Some didn't. One guy claimed it gave him marriage advice. Another swore it told him to become a beekeeper. It might have just been wind. But the relic stayed. Was it divine? Or just a hollow stone with good reverb? Does it matter? This was a time when bread crusts from saints were venerated and people prayed to thumb bones. If it echoed, it was sacred. End of story. Back in your monastery, you're being sent out on echo duty. This is an unofficial task created by Brother Mauric to test your humility. It involves walking into the woods at dusk and shouting scripture into the air. You're supposed to listen carefully for what the world gives back. You go out. It's damp. The air smells like moss and wood rot. You whisper, "The Lord is my shepherd." A bird squawks in reply. Not helpful. You try again. Louder this time. And then it comes. "The Lord is my shepherd. Shepherd. Shepherd." It's beautiful, in a way. Also terrifying. Because now something is whispering your words back. And it's not Brother Elric hiding in a bush again. You checked. You stand there for a while, letting the silence settle. Listening to the trees breathe. Listening to your own voice bounce off the world and come back a little warped, a little late, but still there. You start to understand what the monks mean. The echo is a mirror. A delay, a hesitation from the universe. It's God saying, I'm here, just slightly behind schedule. Or maybe it's just how sound works. Either way, it's oddly comforting. Because in a world full of fear, plague, and invasive geese, having your voice come back, even if it's distorted, is better than silence. You head back to the abbey. The sun is down. The candlelight flickers like nervous saints. You whisper one last thing into the night. I exist. And the echo replies, I exist. And that's enough. You wake up in a scriptorium. That's Latin for room where people write things very slowly and develop early-onset scoliosis. You've been apprenticed to Master Everard, a man whose beard contains 3 generations of breadcrumbs and who once explained gravity using soup. The room smells like ink, wax, and whatever lives in the corner under the pile of owl feathers. You stretch, crack your back, and look at the parchment in front of you. Your job today is to copy the writings of Isidore of Seville, one of the greatest encyclopedists of the early medieval world and the undisputed king of just making stuff up confidently. Isidore, writing in the 7th century, had a theory about echoes. He believed that an echo was the sound of your voice striking an object and bouncing back. So far, so good. But then he clarified that sound travels like a ball thrown against a wall, or like a voice rebounding off a cliff as if off a shield. Which sounds poetic. Until you realize that means, technically, your voice is a knight now, with a sword, fighting cliffs. But hey, at least he's trying. Scholars in the Middle Ages mostly relied on the work of older thinkers, especially the Greeks, who wrote down a lot of things with great confidence and limited testing. Aristotle, for instance, believed that sound was caused by the striking of the air, and that echoes were simply the air rebouncing after hitting a firm surface. Sort of like a trampoline, but invisible and made of metaphors. By the time this information gets passed down through a few centuries, several monks, and one unfortunate translation by a guy who only half understood Latin, you get theories like, sound is a breath that bounces back like a ball off a wall. Echoes are voices caught in the air that don't know where to go. Air remembers. Yes, some people genuinely thought that air has memory. That when you speak, the air carries your voice, and if the air is in the right mood, it gives it back. Like a very passive-aggressive butler. Before we go further down this rabbit hole of half science and full sarcasm, go ahead and subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying this nap-inducing plunge into medieval absurdity. And let me know in the comments what city or corner of the world you're whispering from. Bonus points if you've ever heard your own echo and blamed it on divine judgment. Now, let's talk about Boethius. Boethius, a Roman philosopher from the 6th century, was widely read in the Middle Ages. He wrote about music, logic, and the nature of sound, although it's not clear if he had ever actually yelled into a cave. His explanation of echoes was based on harmonics. He saw echoes as a kind of auditory reflection, like a visual mirror but for ears. This idea stuck. The concept of mirrors for sound became a popular image in medieval texts. You'll find dozens of manuscripts comparing echoes to the eye's reflection, as if sound waves and light beams were just pals doing the same job for different senses. Which, okay, not the worst analogy. But then it gets weird. Because some thinkers, especially in 13th century France, believed that echoes could blend. That 2 people shouting into the same valley at the same time could mix their words into a single echoed sentence. Like an audio smoothie. This led to real fears of unholy echoes where a prayer and a curse collided in midair and created blasphemous gibberish. This also led to what may be the first medieval group experiment, where monks were told to shout in unison into a cliffside and listen for clarity. Spoiler, they did not hear the Lord's voice. They mostly heard one another shouting slightly off-tempo, and a lot of birds flying away in terror. Then there was the school of Chartres, home to some of the finest medieval minds, like Thierry of Chartres and William of Conches. These thinkers tried to scientifically explain natural phenomena while still being deeply committed to Christian theology. Echoes, to them, were a mechanical result of rarefied air interacting with barriers. That sounds technical. But remember, their experiments often involved ringing bells near sheep and seeing which way the sound went. There's a story about a scholar in Chartres who insisted that echoes could be stored, that a room filled with enough voices might begin to repeat them at random, days later. His proof? He once fell asleep in the lecture hall and claimed he heard his own lecture the next day, without speaking. Historians now believe this was probably another monk pranking him. But in the Middle Ages, if someone said, "This room remembers sound," others just nodded and added it to their manuscripts. You don't argue with someone who owns all the ink. Then we have the speculative thinkers. A small but passionate group believed that echoes were not sound at all, but the spiritual residue of sound. That your voice leaves a mark, like a footprint, and if you step in the right place, the air plays it back. Think ghost hunting, but for your own words. One of these thinkers, a Norse-Irish abbot named Gorm the Gentle, wrote that echoes were memory wells where sound could dwell for a season. He also believed that beings contain souls, so, take that with a medieval pinch of salt. Some manuscripts from Moorish Spain actually get surprisingly close to accurate sound theory. Islamic scholars like Al-Kindi and Al-Farabi had already laid groundwork for understanding vibration and frequency. But as their work passed through Latin translations, it got edited by monks who didn't know Arabic. And so, resonant oscillation became air dances to the voice of the mon, which isn't wrong. But it's also not great science. Let's not forget one of the weirdest entries in medieval echo theory, the bouncing imp. Yes, there were those who thought that echoes were caused by invisible creatures, tiny spirits of mischief, that grabbed your words and threw them back at you. These impish beings were believed to live in cliffs, caves, and particularly annoying churches. If your echo sounded mocking, that was a snarky imp. If it sounded like a prayer, that was a converted imp. This belief was, unsurprisingly, very popular with children, and also one elderly bishop in Prague who used it as an excuse for why his sermons were constantly interrupted by the unholy giggle of the echo demon. But the prize for most confusing echo theory probably goes to the anonymous 14th century friar who wrote the Epistola Vox Dubitata, the letter of the doubting voice. In it, he argues that echoes are not real at all, they are merely reflections of your pride. That only the proud hear echoes, because only the proud expect a reply. According to him, true humility is speaking into silence and accepting no answer. Which is just a poetic way of saying, "Shut up, monk." Back in your scriptorium, Master Everard drops another book in front of you. It's thick, covered in dust, smells like regret. "Write this next," he says. It's a compilation of echo lore, copied from 12 different sources, all with different theories. As you read through the pages, you see the contradictions pile up. Echoes are natural. Echoes are divine. Echoes are dangerous. Echoes are helpful. Echoes come from air. Echoes come from sin. Echoes don't exist. Echoes live in frogs. You close the book, you breathe, and you whisper into the stone walls. Why? And the echo replies, why? Exactly. You're walking along a narrow goat path in the Alps. It's cold. It's always cold. Your boots are soaked with snowmelt. Your left sock is now more of a wet cloth suggestion. And the only warm thing you've had in the past 2 days was a stale onion. Ahead, the path bends into a natural canyon, just a small one nestled between tall slabs of rock. Nothing dramatic. But as you step inside, your own breath seems to echo back at you louder than it should. You sneeze, and the rock walls practically applaud. Congratulations. You've entered what 12th century travelers called the Gorge of Repeating Lies. It got that name after a merchant allegedly confessed his sins to his companion here, and the gorge repeated them loudly for over an hour. According to local records, meaning a 300-year-old logbook kept in a beer-stained monastery, this gorge was believed to trap words of sin and throw them back at the guilty. Never mind the laws of acoustics. The gorge was angry. A cursed place. Local superstition held that the echo was strongest when someone lied. So naturally, no one ever shut up. Whole pilgrimages were made just to yell false confessions and see if the echo reacted differently. You get to the end of the canyon. Someone has carved a warning in Latin into the rock. Non menture hic. I will not lie here. Below that, someone else has scratched in. Except to my wife. But that's just one location. Let's talk about the echoing wells. Throughout medieval Europe, wells were more than just damp holes for water and toads. They were acoustic mysteries. And nothing says science like yelling into a well and blaming Satan when it says hello back. In Kent, England, there was St. Ealdred's Well, famed not just for its sweet water but for what people called its mocking ghost. This well had a narrow shaft and a curved stone lip that created a strong and weirdly delayed echo. People would shout prayers into the well and hear them come back just a bit wrong. "Deliver us from evil," they'd say. And the echo would whisper, "From evil." Cue panic. Or, more commonly, cue another beer. Because let's be honest, it was probably the barley talking. Wells like this dotted the countryside. In France, a town near Rouen had a well that was nicknamed La Gourde de Judas because people swore it only echoed accusations. Villagers would use it to test whether someone was lying. Yes, trial by well. Very official. You'd shout an accusation, like, "Jeffrey stole the ox." And if the well shouted it back, guilty. If it stayed silent, also guilty. Because, as we all know, medieval logic was less about fairness and more about keeping the goat herd intact. Now, let's travel to Italy, to the ruins of Cumae, near Naples. This was home to the Sibyl's Cave, a site of ancient prophecy and echo legend. According to long-standing belief, this cave had acoustic properties so strange that it could repeat a voice without a speaker. A priest could stand inside, ask a question, and the echo would answer without being prompted. Early medieval travelers called this place the Cave of God's Rebuttal, because apparently people came to yell questions at the divine and got sarcastic replies. In one account, a pilgrim shouts, "Am I destined for heaven?" The cave answers, "For heaven," which, as we've seen, is ambiguous enough to either comfort or deeply disturb you. A few centuries later, an enterprising monk tried to build a portable echo machine based on this cave. He created a chamber of curved wood planks and tried to trap sound inside it. He failed spectacularly. His only result was inventing a room that made farts last 17% longer than average. The church was not impressed. Meanwhile, in Ireland, echoes took on a more spiritual tone. The cliffs of Moher, which were known even back then, were said to hold the laughter of saints. People believed that if you shouted praise, the cliffs would answer sweetly. If you shouted curses, the cliffs would respond with a wind strong enough to knock you off. Realistically, it was just the acoustics of a massive wall of rock and some very enthusiastic Atlantic winds. But back then, the only thing blowing harder than the sea breeze was theological speculation. Now, let's go deep into Germany, where things get unsettling. Near the Black Forest, there was a ravine known as der Flustertopf, which roughly translates to the whisper pot. It was a narrow, dome-shaped rock formation with bizarre echo behavior. The story goes that local farmers would whisper secrets into the rocks and come back the next morning to hear their words whispered back. Some believed it was a spirit. Others believed the rocks were recording sound, making der Flustertopf the world's first accidental tape recorder, if you ignore the complete lack of magnetic material and all of physics. Still, the belief endured. People treated it like an audio diary. Want to propose marriage, but not ready to say it out loud? Whisper it to the rocks. Want to curse your boss? Tell the whisper pot. One confused traveler reported that he heard 5 different confessions while just standing quietly with his sheep. The poor sheep are still traumatized. And if you think the strange places were limited to Europe, think again. Records from traders along the Silk Road mention talking valleys in the Caucasus Mountains, where echoes were so precise they mimic human speech. One trader from Baghdad claimed he heard his own voice repeating his haggling attempt 30 minutes later as he made camp. He also claimed the valley accused him of cheating. This would be dismissed as fantasy, except the same valley is described in 3 different travelogues, each one more dramatic than the last. In one, the echo calls a merchant a liar. In another, it allegedly starts singing. In the third, a camel reportedly refused to move after hearing its own bray echo back louder than expected. The echo haunted that camel for life. But let's return to England once more, where in the 14th century, a nobleman built a talking garden. Yes, an echo garden. A series of archways, hedges, and curved walls designed to bounce voices around in a controlled way. He called it the Whisper Court, and it was used for gossip, prayer, and romantic declarations. Unfortunately, it was also used by his servants to rehearse insults about him, which he later overheard bouncing softly off the stone arches. The estate records describe a dramatic incident in which the Lord heard, on a gentle breeze. Lord Edmund's beard looks like a drowned squirrel. He had 3 gardeners flogged. But the echo lived on. Today, All we have are fragments of stone, some partial maps, and a single diagram of what might be a giant medieval ear carved into a wall. And all of this tells us one thing. In the Middle Ages, people didn't just hear echoes, they built for them. They feared them. They tested them. And above all, they treated echoes as real, interactive participants in the natural world. Because when you don't understand sound physics, everything is magic. And magic, as we all know, is best experienced while lying on your back, staring at the ceiling, and hoping the voice calling back from the walls isn't your landlord. It's the year 1093, and you're a monk transcribing a Latin manuscript about natural philosophy. You haven't eaten anything green in 3 months. Your ink smells like moldy walnuts. Your back is permanently shaped like a question mark. And right now, you're carefully copying down a theory that says, Echo is the voice of a woman cursed by the gods, trapped forever in the air. You pause. You stare into the distance. You wonder how someone could be trapped in the air, and whether this explains why you always hear your name when you're drunk. The theory comes, of course, from Roman myth. According to Ovid's Metamorphoses, Echo was a mountain nymph cursed by the goddess Hera to only repeat what others said. This was because she distracted Hera with endless chatter while Zeus was off, shall we say, auditing local nymph populations. Echo eventually falls in love with Narcissus, who ignores her because he's in love with himself. Very relatable behavior if you've ever met a medieval knight or a philosophy major. She wastes away, leaving only her voice behind. Now, the Greeks understood this was a story, a metaphor, a poetic way to explain natural phenomena. But the medieval world? Oh no, they took it literally. Echo became an actual figure in early medieval texts. Theologians speculated on her nature. Was she a ghost? A demon? A cursed pagan? Could she be saved? Should you pray for her? One monk in the 10th century even argued that Echo was one of the air spirits, neither angel nor demon, but a kind of sentient sound cloud wandering the earth, repeating words because she lacked free will. So, basically, Siri with abandonment issues. This idea became very convenient when certain places echoed and no one knew why. Oh, don't worry, they'd say. That's just Echo. She lives in that cave. In fact, some chapels in mountainous regions would bless their walls to ward off Echo. Because, of course, a disembodied woman's voice repeating prayers must be a trap. It's not an echo. It's witchcraft. Obvious conclusion. And speaking of witchcraft, let's talk about the echo demons. In several witch hunting manuals, because yes, those were a thing, there are references to demonic presences mimicking voices in the forest or near streams. The implication? That some echoes weren't natural at all, but evil spirits trained in ventriloquism. One infamous text, De Prestigiis Daemonum by Johann Weyer, 1563, includes an anecdote about a hunter in Bavaria who shouted into a ravine, heard his voice return, and assumed it was his brother answering. He followed the voice, and was never seen again. Now, this is probably just your standard horror story to prevent drunken hiking situation. But it became a cautionary tale. By the 14th century, several Christian thinkers proposed that Satan used echoes to lure the faithful off course. Imagine that. You're on a pilgrimage. You hear someone yell your name. You follow the sound, fall down a slope, and boom, eternal damnation. All because the rocks were too bouncy. One 13th century preacher even warned, "Beware the rocks that speak with thy own voice, for the devil is a mimic." Which, honestly, is kind of metal. And then, of course, we come to the medieval obsession with talkative women. Echo, being the original woman who wouldn't stop talking, was the perfect symbol of what terrified monks more than sin, famine, or France, female autonomy. You see, when echoes happened in churches or in nature, theologians sometimes blamed them not just on cursed spirits, but on the idea of women's voices lingering too long in the air. It was seen as unnatural for a woman's speech to persist after she stopped speaking. Because clearly the air should be a patriarchy. There's a particularly charming 12th century text by a French cleric named Bernard of Clairvaux, where he claims that echoing voices in abbeys were a sign that the monks were being taunted by the feminine. No explanation offered. He just says, "Beware the voice that repeats itself." It is like the woman who gossips thrice what was spoken once. This may be the earliest recorded medieval example of mansplaining sound physics. In rural communities, especially in forested regions of Germany, There were local legends of the talking wife, a ghost who lived in trees and repeated everything her husband said. She was blamed for arguments, misunderstandings, and, in one case, the local beer shortage. It's never made clear whether she was an actual ghost or just the auditory effect of tall trees and a stubborn husband yelling at bark. And you can't have fear without punishment. In several villages, people were told not to speak aloud near cliffs or caves, for fear of waking the echo woman. Children were told she would curse their tongues. Men were warned she'd tempt them with flattery. In other words, if your own voice sounded good, it was a trap. Typical medieval logic. Even more confusingly, some folklore claimed echo was a helpful spirit, particularly in Eastern Europe. In certain Slavic regions, echoes were believed to be the voices of forest guardians. Shepherds would call out to the trees and expect answers. But if the echo came back angry or didn't come back at all, it meant something terrible was coming: bandits, wolves, or taxes. These echo guardians were often portrayed as female, too. But unlike the Western tradition of bad echo woman equals sin, the Slavic version was more maternal. Echo spirits were said to protect lost children, warn hunters, and sometimes lead the faithful to safety. So clearly, Echo had a PR problem. Depending on where you were in Europe, she was either a demon, a banshee, an angel, or your passive-aggressive ex. And because everything eventually had to be made political, echoes also got caught up in royal propaganda. In one 15th-century English ballad, a king is described as so powerful that even the hills repeat his wisdom. This was not just poetic fluff. It was intended to imply that even nature agreed with the king's opinions. Convenient. And when Henry VII seized the throne after the Wars of the Roses, chroniclers claimed that his speeches in certain halls caused echoes of unity. Yes, someone actually wrote that. Echoes of unity, which is probably the medieval equivalent of a soundbite focus tested by 4 bishops and a horse. But back to the darkness. By the later Middle Ages, echoes became associated with unrest souls. If someone was murdered in a particular location, people claimed that yelling near the site would cause unnatural echoing. In Welsh tradition, some believed that echoes in the mountains were the cries of those who had died in battle, replaying forever. You can imagine how terrifying that would be. You're a farmer. You're walking home. You drop your bucket and curse. And suddenly, the hills curse back in your exact voice. Do you think, yes, reflection of sound waves in open air? No. You think, the cursed warrior of Dinah's brand has returned to haunt my bucket. Because again, why use logic when you can have haunted kitchenware? And so, to sum up, by the time you reach the 1500s, Europe is fully divided on what echoes are. They might be a cursed woman, a helpful forest nymph, a literal demon, God testing your honesty, nature's gossip column, or just you, but with worse timing. Whichever theory you chose, you were probably wrong, but very confident. And somewhere, in a damp monastery cell, another monk is writing down his thoughts about it, trying not to think about the voice he heard repeating his prayers last night. He says it was just an echo, just stone and air. But he still hasn't gone back in that chapel. And honestly, can you blame him? You've survived the ghost stories, demon warnings, and accusations that echoes are just women being too loud from beyond the grave. You've wandered through mountains, monasteries, and folklore thick enough to trip over. Now, at long last, it's time for a brief, glimmering detour into something resembling science. Don't get too excited. This is still medieval Europe. Science here means educated guesses, geometry drawn on parchment by candlelight, and experiments conducted using church bells, hollow gourds, and the occasional screaming goat. We're entering the era of late medieval natural philosophy. A time when people began wondering if maybe, just maybe, echoes were not caused by ghosts or nymphs, but by physics. You know, that dangerous, radical idea. Let's begin with the 14th century university lecture hall, which sounds impressive until you remember it's just a cold stone room filled with students in robes that smell like wet hay and despair. You're sitting in the back, chewing on a goose feather. The professor, Brother Theobald, let's call him, is explaining Aristotle's theory of sound. Sound, he says, is movement in the air. It travels like ripples in a pond. When those ripples bounce off a hard surface, like a wall, a cliff, or an unusually stubborn ox, they reflect back. The reflected sound is an echo. You blink. You consider this. It sounds almost reasonable. Of course, Theobald ruins it a moment later by adding, and thus we see, the echo is the air's memory, sent by the prime mover to remind us of original sound. Ah yes, the prime mover. Aristotle's way of saying, God did it, but with slightly more vowels. Still, this idea, sound is movement, gains traction. Scholars start writing treatises about sound waves, even though they don't call them that yet. They refer to them as pulses or air motions, which makes it sound like the wind is having a panic attack. One of the more ambitious thinkers is Robert Grosset Este, a 13th century English bishop who dabbled in everything from theology to optics to acoustics. He theorized that echoes are the result of sound rays being reflected, similar to light bouncing off a mirror. This was wildly advanced for his time. Unfortunately, he also believed that echoes sometimes carried spiritual residue, and that too many echoes in one place could make the air dense with confusion. Which is a poetic way of saying a cave is loud. Still, Grosset Este planted the seeds of what would become acoustic theory. But it's another scholar, Roger Bacon, who really dives in headfirst. Roger Bacon is the kind of person who wouldn't survive 5 minutes on TikTok, but would absolutely write a 70-page essay on why bells echo differently in different towns. Which, incidentally, he did. He argued that echoes were not supernatural at all but purely natural phenomena, caused by air pressure, distance, and the material of the reflecting surface. In one experiment, and I swear this is true, he reportedly shouted into a giant gourd and timed how long it took for the echo to return. This led to his now famous declaration: "The sound bounces as the ball bounces, returning not as itself, but as its likeness." Translation: sound has a boomerang problem. Unfortunately, very few people listened to Bacon. Not because he wasn't brilliant, but because he also believed in alchemy, time travel, and possibly that the moon made people evil. So his reputation was complicated. Now, let's talk about geometry. Because some medieval scholars decided to stop fearing echoes and start measuring them. Picture this, it's 1452. You're a university student in Padua. You haven't bathed in 3 weeks. Your roommate keeps bringing leeches home. And your geometry professor has just wheeled in a wooden contraption that looks like a cross between a siege weapon and a wine rack. He calls it the reflector. It's essentially a cone lined with animal skin, designed to amplify and reflect sound. Students are instructed to yell into it, then measure how long it takes for the echo to return from a far wall. They do this by counting heartbeats. Yes, heartbeats. Because pendulums haven't been invented yet, and clocks are for rich people and cathedral towers. You spend the next 6 weeks yelling into cones, counting 1, 2, 3, 4, echo. And eventually, someone notices that the further away the wall is, the longer the delay. Congratulations. You've discovered the speed of sound. You're off by several hundred meters per second. But hey, progress. This is also the time when scholars start building echo chambers on purpose. Not the social media kind. Literal echo chambers, rooms with hard surfaces, curved walls, and perfect acoustics for bouncing sound back and forth. They test these rooms using shouting monks, clapping assistants, and in one case, a donkey trained to bray on command. Because what else are you going to do with a donkey in a philosophy department? The results are mixed. Some rooms echo beautifully. Others just muffle everything and make it sound like you're yelling into a loaf of bread. But the important thing is, they're trying. They're asking questions. They're measuring things. They're not burning anyone for talking near a cave. And that, my friend, is what counts for scientific progress in the Middle Ages. But not everyone was happy. You see, this shift toward natural explanation made some church leaders nervous. If echoes were just bouncing air, where did that leave all the demons, spirits, and cursed women they'd been preaching about for centuries? One archbishop even warned that the explanation of echoes without divine mystery is a sign of creeping heresy. Because if you can explain echoes with math, maybe you'll start questioning thunder, or eclipses, or why the bishop needs so much gold. So the echo debate split into 2 camps. Team physics versus team, it's obviously the devil. Shut up. And for the next 100 years, both theories coexisted, awkwardly, like roommates who've agreed not to talk about politics. Meanwhile, everyday people continue to experience echoes the way they always had, with confusion, suspicion, and the occasional burst of joy. Children still shouted into wells. Lovers still sang in canyons. Pilgrims still called to the hills and waited for answers. And once in a while, when a scholar or monk or traveling juggler stood in the perfect spot and heard their own voice return, they smiled. Not because they understood it, but because, for just a moment, the world seemed to be listening, even if it was just bouncing the nonsense back. So, to recap, by the 14th century, educated people began rejecting supernatural echo theories. They embraced Aristotle's idea of air movement and started experimenting with real measurements. Echoes became objects of study instead of fear. But plenty of folks still clung to the old legends. Because let's be honest, ghosts are more fun than geometry. And donkeys make terrible lab assistants. You are now lying somewhere between folklore and early science, between haunted cliffs and echo chambers made of brick and skin. You are watching medieval Europe inch its way toward truth, very slowly, with many detours and at least one gourd-based experiment. And if that's not relaxing enough to lull you to sleep, just wait. The year is now 1501. You survived the plagues, the pitchforks, the phantom voices, and the monks muttering into fruit. You've listened patiently as Europe tried to explain echoes with curses, with cursed women, and with women cursed for talking. But now you find yourself at a curious turning point in history. One where everything that was once feared is now painted, sung, written about, tested. This is the Renaissance, which is Latin for everyone suddenly got opinions again, including about echoes. You wake up in Florence, your mattress stuffed with straw, anxiety, and probably a few rats. Your ceiling is painted, your bed frame is splintery, and your window opens onto a noisy alley where someone is yelling about olive oil again. But you're not just any Renaissance citizen. No, you're a minor apprentice to a minor painter who once mixed paint for someone who once met Leonardo da Vinci's barber. You wear a tunic. You have opinions about perspective. And today, you're going to think about echoes, not as witchcraft, but as art. Because here in the Renaissance, echoes have become fashionable. Let's start with the artists. By 1510, echoes were appearing everywhere in poetry, painting, and sculpture. Not just as mysterious effects of sound, but as symbols, allegories, fancy metaphors. Take Leonardo da Vinci, for example. Because, of course, the man couldn't sneeze without inventing a new form of applied physics. In his notebooks, Leonardo writes about echoes as the rebound of sound, much as light rebounds from water. He even sketches diagrams of how sound might travel in straight lines, bounce off walls, and return, just like rays of light. Which would have been extremely helpful if anyone else could read his notes. But alas, Leonardo wrote in mirror script. Because of course he did. He also conducted echo experiments using musical instruments, lutes, flutes, and something called a clavicimbalum, which sounds like a Harry Potter spell but was actually an early harpsichord. He'd play a note in a large room, then measure how long the sound took to return. Legend says he once tried this in a Tuscan canyon, shouting musical notes at the rock walls and sketching how the echo changed pitch. You might call this the first recorded instance of outdoor sound design. You might also call it a man yelling scales at rocks while everyone around him pretended to be very, very interested. Elsewhere in Italy, echoes were showing up in poetry. You couldn't swing a lute without hitting a sonnet where someone used echoes to symbolize heartbreak. A typical poem might go like this. I cry amore to the hills, and they return more, more, more. Yet never the love I seek. It's all very tragic, very echo-chic. And then there's Ariosto, the Italian poet who decided that echo wasn't a spirit or a demon, but a kind of sentient memory. In his epic Orlando Furioso, he describes echoes as nature remembering what we say and choosing to say it back. Which is a beautiful idea, until you realize it means that every time you tripped and yelled ow, the mountains remember that forever. Even architects got involved. In Renaissance Florence and Rome, architects started designing courtyards and chapels to amplify echoes rather than suppress them. Acoustics became part of the blueprint. Arch ceilings, curved apses, domes, all designed to enhance sound for choirs, sermons, and dramatic whispers. In fact, the famed whispering gallery effect, where a whisper on one side of a curved wall can be heard clearly on the other, became a sort of parlor trick in noble households. Guests would be seated at opposite ends of a domed hallway, say scandalous things, and listen as their words traveled like well-behaved ghosts across the space. It was elegant. It was eerie. And it was, finally, fun. But not everyone was satisfied with just art and architecture. Some people, unfortunately for everyone's patience, wanted to measure things properly. Enter the amateur scientists of the 16th century. You know the type. Wealthy men with too much time, too many books, and an alarming interest in waveforms. They wore breeches, they quoted Aristotle, and they were ready to get loud. One of the more notorious of these was Giovanni Battista Benedetti, a mathematician from Venice who tried to calculate the angle at which sound reflects. He theorized that echoes behave like billiard balls, they bounce at the same angle they arrive. Which is correct. But it made him very unpopular at parties. To test his theory, he built a large echoing room and hired assistants to shout words at various angles. This was called reverberation testing, but it basically amounted to grown men shouting banana at walls while someone measured it with string. In one of his notes, he wrote, "A shout of Alleluia at 45 degrees returns at 45 degrees. The symmetry is divine." Which raises the question, who was shouting Alleluia into walls in the name of science? The answer, apparently, was everyone. And if you were French during this period, you were probably busy building grottos. Yes, grottos. Those fake decorative caves that wealthy nobles used as private retreats. They were the perfect echo chamber, and soon they became all the rage. One famous example was in the gardens of the Château de Fontainebleau, where courtiers would enter a man-made cave and shout things like "Long live the king," just to hear the echo agree with them. Talk about echo chambers. By the mid-1500s, Jesuit scholars were publishing treatises that blended acoustics with theology. One such text, De Sonitu et Vocis Reflexioni, argued that the echo was proof of divine order, since it obeyed predictable laws. Others claimed that echoes represented the soul's longing to return to its source. Beautiful. Incomprehensible. But very on-brand for Renaissance philosophy. Meanwhile, in England, echoes got literary. In Shakespeare's time, echoes were used as plot devices and poetic flourishes. In The Rape of Lucrece, he writes, "This said, he shakes aloft his Roman blade, which, like a falcon towering in the skies, couched with her beak his princely sounding name, that echo made her voice his fame proclaim." Translation: echoes are now PR agents for noble deeds. Shakespeare also uses echoes metaphorically, lovers calling across empty landscapes, soldiers yelling into voids. The echo becomes a sign of absence, of longing, of lost purpose. And of course, a great way to stall for time when your play runs 3 hours long. But perhaps the strangest echo-related invention of the Renaissance is the echo organ. Yes, that's a real thing. An echo organ was a pipe organ with a secondary set of pipes located elsewhere in the church, often high in the rafters or behind a wall. When played in tandem, the second set of pipes created a delayed, ghostly sound that imitated a natural echo. Churchgoers were stunned. Was it divine? Was it magic? Was it sound design? Turns out, it was just an early experiment in artificial reverb. And it worked beautifully. People wept. Nobles donated money. Priests wrote about the voice of God answering from above, which honestly just means someone nailed the mix. But as with all things Renaissance, there's a catch. For every thoughtful acoustic experiment, there were 5 nobles building ridiculous echo traps in their gardens. Elaborate stone archways designed to shout their own names back at them. Grottos built just to amplify giggles. One estate even had a singing fountain that whispered your own compliments back to you. So yes, we're now at the point in history where echoes have gone from terrifying forest ghosts to literal ego boosters. Which, if you think about it, is kinda perfect. So, let's review. Echoes in the Renaissance became art, poetry, and architectural marvels. Scholars began to understand them as physical, not mystical. Instruments were invented to imitate echoes on purpose. Rich people turned echo chambers into ego chambers. And Leonardo da Vinci probably invented acoustic science, but forgot to tell anyone. You're now standing on the threshold of modernity. You've survived the haunted, echoing hills of superstition. You've yelled into science with a goat. You sat through 6 opera-length sonnets about how echoes symbolize unrequited love. And yet, despite all the Renaissance brilliance and innovation, one thing remains unchanged. No one can resist the urge to shout into a cave and wait for it to shout back. Even now, even here, even you. But hold on. You wake up groggy. Not because you were out late inventing perspective or debating Aristotle, but because someone is banging a giant bronze gong just outside your tent. Again, you sit up in your straw cot, wrapped in the gentle scent of leather, mildew, and existential dread. You're a soldier now. Or, at least, you're wearing armor, which is close enough. You're part of a 16th century mercenary band that has found itself somewhere between employed and abandoned. Your current assignment: lie in wait outside a fortified city, march occasionally in a circle, and make as much noise as humanly possible. Because today, sound is a weapon. Welcome to the age of acoustic warfare, an era of pre-modern military strategy so loud, so absurd, and so questionably effective, it makes modern warfare look like quiet quitting. And the best part? The generals actually thought they understood how sound worked. Which, as you know by now, means this is going to go very, very wrong. So before we dive into how echoes became terrifying siege tools and psychological warfare devices, remember to gently smash that like button, only if you're genuinely enjoying this sleep-deprived journey through sonic nonsense, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Bonus points if you're under a weighted blanket, drinking chamomile, or hiding from your own echo. All right, onward. Let's start with the basics. By the 1500s and into the 1600s, echoes weren't just metaphorical anymore. They were strategic. Generals, engineers, and the occasional deranged noble began using echoes in war planning, sometimes by accident, often on purpose. It started with a simple observation: castles echo. Their thick stone walls, cavernous interiors, and winding corridors created perfect conditions for sound to bounce and travel. So naturally, someone thought, hey, what if we use this echo to scare the absolute woolen trousers off our enemies? Cue the false army tactic. You and your fellow mercenaries have been ordered to march across a stone bridge at dawn. Not once, not twice, but for 5 straight hours, in circles. Wearing your loudest armor, you clang your sword against your shield. You stomp dramatically. And every time you cross the archway, the noise bounces off the surrounding cliffs. Inside the castle, the defenders hear what they think is an army 10 times your size approaching. Panic ensues. Soldiers abandon their posts. The cook drops the pot of turnip stew. A messenger sprints to the tower shouting, "We're surrounded." You're not. But the sound says otherwise. This tactic was reportedly used during the 30 Years' War, where commanders like Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden used drums, horns, and boots to trick enemy garrisons into thinking reinforcements had arrived. Echoes amplified the illusion. You might call it psychological warfare. You might also call it sonic cosplay. Another favorite tactic? The echo drill. During sieges, armies would often stage fake drills, loud, echo-prone marches outside enemy walls, to confuse and exhaust their foes. From the ramparts, defenders would hear endless clashing and shouting, never knowing if an attack was real or just another noisy rehearsal. Eventually, sleep-deprived, paranoid, and likely malnourished, the defending forces would crack. All thanks to the humble echo. There were even reports, though, let's be honest, probably exaggerated, of castles surrendering to phantom armies. All because someone shouted really well into a gorge. But wait, it gets louder. Let's talk about cannons. Now, cannons are already loud. But early commanders noticed that when a cannon was fired in a narrow valley or stone-fortified city, the echo was staggering. Like thunder in a wine barrel, or God slamming a door upstairs. So, commanders began timing their cannon fire specifically to exploit these echoes. A single cannon might sound like 3 or 4 if placed correctly. The idea was to create acoustic terror, a wall of noise so overwhelming that it broke enemy morale. During the siege of La Rochelle in 1627, French forces allegedly used cannon echo tricks to simulate continuous bombardment even when they were low on powder. Imagine the sheer chaos. One boom echoed 5 times, bouncing off the sea walls, rattling down narrow stone streets. The defenders believed they were under constant attack, but really, the cannons were only fired intermittently. It's kind of genius. It's also kind of annoying, because you're the one who has to stand next to it. Your ears are ringing. Your teeth feel like they're vibrating. You haven't slept in 3 days because the echo of a single cannon blast sounds like a thunderstorm inside a cave full of metal pots. And that's not even the worst part. Let's visit Eastern Europe, where echoes weren't just a tool, they were considered a sign from heaven. At the fortress of Kamianets-Podilskyi, in what is now Ukraine, 17th century defenders noticed that cannon fire echoed unusually well across the nearby gorge. When the echo was loud and clear, they believed it meant divine favor. When it was muffled, it meant doom. So, of course, artillerymen began experimenting with superstitious acoustic placement. Move the cannon 6 feet to the left. Boom, that's a holy echo. Move it back. Boom, a cursed one. You're now navigating the battlefield by divine sonic Yelp reviews. Across the Ottoman front, engineers began designing resonating walls, concave surfaces around cannons and horns meant to direct and amplify sound toward enemy positions. The idea was to weaponize resonant terror, create walls of reflected sound that made it seem like your army had thunder on its side. This wasn't limited to big weapons, either. Drummers became essential components of echo warfare. In valleys, they'd perform overlapping rhythmic patterns designed to confuse listeners about distance and size. One lone drummer, cleverly placed in a ravine, could sound like dozens, an audio hallucination engineered from hills and hollows. Of course, this also made communication a nightmare. You try shouting retreat across a stone field, only to hear it bounce back as meat. Meat, followed by the sound of 30 confused soldiers running toward the cookfire. In fact, several battles were lost due to misinterpreted echoes. Troop orders heard twice, too late, or just plain wrong. There are stories, glorious, possibly apocryphal, of cavalry charging in the opposite direction after echo confusion. All because someone yelled left flank, and the canyon yelled back, and then everyone got stabbed. And now, because no weird acoustic tangent would be complete without it, let's discuss the war trumpets. Imagine you're on the battlefield. You hear a long, trembling note from a horn. Then you hear it again. And again. It seems to be coming from everywhere at once. That's the Naker trumpet, an instrument specifically designed to be used in echo-rich terrain. Its notes, low, eerie, and reverb-heavy, were meant to create auditory illusions. Entire divisions of soldiers would stop mid-march, unnerved, trying to locate a source that didn't exist. One German engineer claimed to have built a multi-horn siege vehicle, a kind of sound tank that blasted noise into enemy camps using horn arrays and echo dishes. It didn't do much damage, but it scared the livestock, which was apparently the goal. And let's not forget the wall screamers. In some cities under siege, defenders installed clay tubes or trumpet-shaped vents into walls to direct sound outward. Yell into the tube? The shout echoes across the field like a megaphone. Perfect for terrifying your enemies with sudden war cries, or just yelling insults at 120 decibels. One Italian siege record mentions a man yelling, "Your mother makes bad porridge," through a vent. It echoed across the battlefield, struck a cavalry commander square in the dignity, and allegedly delayed the charge by 3 hours. So, to recap, echoes became psychological weapons during early modern warfare. Marching, drumming, cannon fire, and shouting were all amplified to simulate larger forces. Miscommunication from echoes literally turned battles. Siege architecture started including acoustic tools, on purpose. And somewhere, some poor drummer is still banging a snare in a valley, wondering if anyone heard him. By this point in your sleepy, echo-haunted life, you've seen echoes evolve from spirits, to metaphors, to architectural features, to literal instruments of war. And yet, the most terrifying echo of all is still to come. You wake up again. But this time, there's no chanting monks, no cannon fire, no enchanted valleys yelling at you in Latin. No, this time, you're surrounded by paper. Paper everywhere. Stacked in piles, ink-smudged, some of it suspiciously damp, as if someone cried on it while calculating the speed of sound. You, my unfortunate listener, have fallen asleep in the 17th century, inside what passes for a laboratory. There's no Bunsen burner, no sterile glassware, no Wi-Fi. Just some candles, quill pens, and a very enthusiastic man in a wig muttering to himself in French. Welcome to the scientific revolution, where echoes are finally being measured, studied, and, most dangerously of all, understood. Or at least, misunderstood more precisely. You look over. A mun is holding a stopwatch, or what passes for one, more like a glorified egg timer. He's timing the gap between a musket firing and the echo bouncing off a nearby wall. This is Marin Mersenne, and he's about to ruin the magic of echoes forever. But before we get too deep into the echo-killing math party, remember to take a second, only if you're genuinely enjoying this, and hit that like button. It helps keep the channel alive, keeps the candles burning, and ensures that someday, someone else gets to fall asleep listening to a 90-minute rant about 17th century French acousticians. Leave a comment too. I love reading where you're tuning in from, and if you're horizontal under a weighted blanket, bonus points. All right, time to ruin the mystery. So who is Marin Mersenne? He's a French polymath, a word which here means guy who knew a little too much about everything. Mathematics, music theory, theology, mechanics, and now, acoustics. Specifically, the speed of sound. Now, to you, modern person, in a world of Google, Bluetooth, and extremely opinionated Reddit forums, this doesn't sound impressive. But at the time, it was revolutionary. Mersenne figured out that if you fired a musket at a wall and measured the time it took for the echo to return, you could estimate the speed of sound. He didn't get it exactly right. He thought it was about 1,380 feet per second. Modern measurements put it closer to 1,125. But still, pretty good for someone without a microphone or a calculator. This, naturally, ruined everything. Because once you start measuring echoes, they lose their mystical charm. They stop being nymphs or spirits or harbingers of doom and start being math. And no one likes math when they're trying to sleep. But don't worry. Even as the science advanced, the nonsense kept pace. Let's talk about Athanasius Kircher, a German Jesuit scholar and professional chaos wizard. He believed in everything: alchemy, magnetism, music as medicine, volcanoes being connected by underground fire veins. He even wrote a book on how echoes could be used to summon angels. Yes, really. He was obsessed with echo chambers, not the Twitter kind, but actual architectural spaces that reflected sound. Kircher believed you could build structures that amplified voices using hidden pipes and chambers, creating what he called speaking statues. And he actually built some. Imagine walking through a quiet garden. A statue of Apollo stands in front of you. You speak. Seconds later, the statue responds in your own voice, but twisted, distorted by stone tubes and reflective chambers. It's not just an echo. It's interactive. These were called acoustic marvels, and Kircher proposed installing them in cathedrals, palaces, even confessionals. Because nothing says forgiveness like being gently mocked by your own sins bouncing back at you in Latin. But while Kircher was off building ghost tubes, real scientists were moving in. Let's talk about Isaac Newton. Now, Newton didn't care much about echoes. He was busy inventing physics and making apples famous, but his laws of motion helped others formalize how sound waves behave. And once you know that sound travels in waves, you can start predicting how those waves bounce, refract, and echo. Enter acoustical engineering. By the early 18th century, architects began designing spaces specifically with echoes in mind. And not just to avoid them, but to use them. Opera houses, parliament buildings, cathedrals. Suddenly, echo wasn't just an accidental side effect, it was part of the plan. And this brings us to the great divide: good echoes versus bad echoes. Good echoes are soft, reinforcing. They make music sound richer. Voices sound grander. You stand at the altar in a 17th century cathedral, say a single amen, and hear it ripple like silk through marble. Bad echoes? Those are the ones that make you feel like you're shouting into a tin can full of pigeons. The kind that turns "we must proceed with caution" into we proceed with caution, and gets your general very stabbed very fast. To solve this, scholars like John Tyndall and later Wallace Sabine, in the 19th century, began developing formulas for acoustic clarity. Echoes were finally classified, analyzed, and, yes, monetized. Which brings us, depressingly, to capitalism. Because once people realized echoes could be controlled, the natural next step was to sell them. Want a concert hall that sounds like God himself is playing the violin? Want a courtroom where every whisper carries like a divine verdict? Want a ballroom where your mediocre waltz feels like the soundtrack to a royal love affair? Well, then you'll need to hire an acoustical consultant, friend. One who can manipulate echoes to suit your brand, your politics, your vibe. Echoes went from spiritual mystery to luxury commodity. And just like that, centuries of echo mythology collapsed under a wave of soundproofing materials and strategically placed velvet curtains. But even as science dissected the echo, the old beliefs didn't vanish. In rural parts of Europe, echoes were still considered omens well into the 19th century. A loud echo meant a coming storm. A faint one signaled death. Shepherds in the Alps told stories of hearing their own voices respond in strange tones, echoes twisted by ghosts or worse, by demons mimicking their speech. And even in the modern world, echoes retain a sliver of mystique. Think about it. You walk into an empty gymnasium. You clap. The sound returns to you seconds later, shapeless, haunting, delayed. In that moment, you're no longer a person with a body and a schedule. You're a voice, briefly immortal, bouncing off the fabric of space, whispering back to yourself across time. There's a reason we keep using the word echo in poetry, in grief, in memory. Because the echo is us. Filtered. Distorted. Repeating what we said, but never exactly the same. A shadow of our speech. A reminder that we were here, and now we're not. And maybe that's the most medieval thing of all. So, to summarize this deeply unnecessary chapter, scientists eventually measured the speed of sound using musket echoes. Jesuits built haunted echo statues to impress people. Echoes went from religious metaphor to architectural tool. Wealthy patrons bought acoustics like they bought wigs. And no matter how well we understand them, echoes still feel a little spooky. Now, if you've made it this far, you've survived. Talking caves, punishing nymphs, echo warfare, and 17th century Frenchmen yelling at walls. And the best part? We're still not done.